Dear listener, settle yourself comfortably now, and let the gentle magic of this tale wash over you like moonlight through an enchanted window. Tonight, we journey into the world of witches and wizards, to a time when the great darkness had finally lifted and the wizarding world was slowly, carefully, learning to breathe again. Our story belongs to a man whose name may not echo through history with the thunder of great warriors, but whose quiet brilliance and unwavering curiosity would prove just as vital to the safety of both magical and non-magical folk alike. Arthur Weasley, father, husband, ministry employee, and a man whose fascination with the mundane world of Muggles had long been considered charmingly eccentric by his peers, stands at the heart of this narrative. In the months following the fall of Lord Voldemort, as the Ministry of Magic worked to rebuild both its crumbling stone and shattered trust, Arthur would stumble upon a secret that had been carefully buried for decades. A secret that connected the world he loved to the world he served in ways both wondrous and terrifying. So breathe deeply now, dear listener, and let yourself drift into this tale of discovery, courage, and the magic that exists not just in wands and spells, but in curiosity itself. The war is over. The wounds are healing, and in the quiet spaces between reconstruction and remembrance, an adventure is about to unfold. In the quiet months after the war, when the wizarding world was healing, Arthur Weasley found himself drawn to the forgotten corners of the Ministry of Magic with an intensity that surprised even him. The building itself bore scars. Walls that had been blasted apart during the final battle now stood repaired, but somehow different. The new stone lighter than the old, creating a patchwork effect that reminded all who walked these halls that history had carved itself deep into this place. The atrium, once gleaming with its fountain of magical brethren, had been redesigned entirely, now featuring a simple, elegant memorial to those who had fallen. Arthur passed it each morning, touching his fingers briefly to the cool black marble, thinking of Fred, thinking of all the others. His new position, senior consultant for post-war ministry restoration and reorganization, had been offered with great ceremony by Kingsley Shacklebolt himself. It was, Arthur understood, partly an honour and partly a kindness. The role gave him purpose in those difficult months when the burrow felt too quiet, when Molly would wake crying in the night, when the absence of Fred's laughter created a silence that no amount of noise could fill. The work was exactly what Arthur needed, methodical, important, and blessedly distracting. His responsibilities took him into departments and divisions that most ministry employees never knew existed. Sub-basements beneath sub-basements, corridors that twisted in architecturally impossible ways, offices sealed since before the First War with Grindelwald. The ministry, Arthur discovered, was rather like a vast archaeological site, with layers of bureaucratic history stacked upon each other, each generation adding new rooms and sealing old ones, until the building had become a labyrinth that defied all logical mapping. It was on a Thursday afternoon in late November, the sky outside a uniform grey that pressed against the ministry's enchanted windows, when Arthur's exploration led him to a door that shouldn't have existed. He had been inspecting the lowest levels of the Department of Mysteries, ensuring that the reconstruction efforts hadn't compromised any of the more delicate experimental chambers. The unspeakables were characteristically tight-lipped about their work, but they'd agreed to his presence as long as he stayed in the designated safe zones. Arthur had been making notes about water damage in what appeared to be a storage area, when his wand, an old habit from the war, detected a magical signature behind a wall of filing cabinets. The cabinets themselves were ancient, crafted from a dark wood that gleamed dully in the torchlight. They stood flush against the wall, heavy with decades of accumulated dust and the particular musty smell of old parchment and dried ink. But Arthur's wand hummed gently in his hand, and when he pressed his palm against the wood, he felt it. A warming charm, active and strong, preserving whatever lay beyond. It took him the better part of an hour to move the cabinets. They were heavier than they looked, enchanted to resist casual investigation. But Arthur had always been patient. He worked slowly, carefully, occasionally pausing to sip from the thermos of tea he'd brought with him. Molly's special blend, with just a touch of calming draught to ease the persistent anxiety that had plagued him since the war. The cabinet slid aside reluctantly, inch by inch, revealing first a crack of deeper darkness, then the outline of a door. It was not a grand door. In fact, it was rather plain. Smooth grey stone with a simple iron handle, unmarked by any plaque or designation. But when Arthur touched the handle, it opened immediately, as though it had been waiting for him, and warm air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of parchment and preservation charms, and something else, something slightly acrid that Arthur couldn't quite place. The room beyond was not large, perhaps 15 feet square, but every wall was lined floor to ceiling with shelves, and every shelf was packed with files, boxes, and what appeared to be dozens of pensive memories stored in crystal files. A single desk stood in the center of the room, and upon it sat an oil lamp, the old-fashioned kind that Muggles once used, burning with a steady, enchanted flame that had likely been alight for decades. Arthur stood in the doorway for a long moment, his heart beating faster with that particular excitement that had always accompanied discovery. This was precisely the sort of thing he loved, the unexpected, the hidden, the mysterious intersection of magic and purpose. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, and approached the nearest shelf. The files were organized with meticulous care, each labeled with dates and cryptic reference numbers. Arthur pulled one at random, a thick manila folder stamped with the year 1952. Inside, he found correspondence between a wizard named Caractacus Burke and the chairman of a Muggle manufacturing company. The letters discussed mutual interests in energy research and collaborative opportunities that transcended traditional boundaries. Arthur's eyebrows rose steadily as he read. The tone was cordial but careful, dancing around specifics in a way that suggested both parties knew they were engaging in something that required discretion. He pulled another file. 1967. This one contained meeting minutes, actual minutes, as though this had been official business, documenting a gathering between 3 ministry officials whose names Arthur didn't recognize, and executives from something called Consolidated British Engineering Limited. The subject of the meeting: potential applications of ambient magical field manipulation in industrial electrical systems. Arthur felt a small shiver run down his spine. He had worked in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office for years, and he knew the laws regarding magical Muggle interaction. What he was reading shouldn't have been possible, not as official ministry business. The statute of secrecy was absolute, and yet here was evidence of systematic, ongoing contact between wizards and Muggle corporations spanning decades. He spent the next 3 hours in that room, pulling file after file, his tea growing cold and forgotten on the desk beside him. The archive, for that's what it clearly was, documented a shadow history of magical Muggle collaboration that no official record acknowledged. The files were dense with technical language that even Arthur, with his passionate interest in Muggle technology, found challenging. There were blueprints that mixed magical runes with electrical circuitry, research proposals that discussed harmonic convergence between magical and electromagnetic fields, and financial records showing enormous sums of money moving between wizarding accounts and Muggle corporate entities. As the evening wore on and the enchanted lamp burned steadily, Arthur began to see patterns emerging from the chaos of information. The collaboration seemed to have intensified during the 1970s, precisely the period when Voldemort's first rise to power was beginning. Several files made oblique references to defensive applications and protective infrastructure. One particularly chilling memo, dated 1978, discussed the necessity of contingency measures should traditional magical defenses prove insufficient. Arthur sat back in the desk chair, ancient leather that creaked softly beneath his weight, and rubbed his eyes beneath his horn-rimmed glasses. His mind was racing, connecting dots, seeing implications that made his stomach tighten with unease. Someone, at some level of the ministry, had believed that magic alone might not be enough to protect the wizarding world. Someone had reached out to Muggle technology as a backup plan, a secret weapon, a hidden defense. But who had authorized it? And more importantly, where had it led? He pulled open a drawer in the desk, finding it filled with more recent files. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted out a folder marked Project Convergence, 1970s, in neat handwriting. The cover was sealed with a complex locking charm that dissolved at his touch. Apparently, whatever protections had once secured this archive had degraded over time, or perhaps had been keyed to ministry employees of a certain clearance level. Inside the folder, Arthur found something that made his breath catch in his throat. Photographs. Not wizard photographs that moved and waved, but Muggle photographs. Grainy and still, showing what appeared to be a large industrial facility. Cooling towers rose in the background, and in the foreground stood a structure that looked like a cross between a Muggle power station and something from the Department of Mysteries. Magical runes were visible, even in the photograph, carved into concrete and steel in patterns that Arthur recognized as protective enchantments of a particularly powerful variety. Attached to the photographs was a technical specification document that ran to dozens of pages. Arthur read the opening summary 3 times, his scientific curiosity warring with growing alarm. Project Convergence represents the successful integration of ambient magical field amplification with industrial-scale electrical generation systems. Through the strategic placement of runic arrays at key electromagnetic nodes, we have created a network capable of channeling and focusing magical energy on an unprecedented scale. Initial tests suggest potential applications in both defensive and offensive capacities. Further development is recommended with highest priority classification. The document was signed by 3 names. 2. Arthur didn't recognize. They were probably unspeakables, working undercover identities. But the 3rd signature made his blood run cold. Barty Crouch Sr. Arthur sat motionless, the file open before him, his mind working through implications that grew darker with each passing moment. Barty Crouch had been a complicated man, known for his hard line against dark wizards during Voldemort's first rise. He had also been ruthless, willing to authorize measures that many considered too extreme. If Crouch had been involved in creating some kind of hybrid magical Muggle weapon system. The lamp flickered slightly, and Arthur realized how late it had grown. The corridor outside would be empty now, the ministry reduced to its skeleton nightstaff. He should leave, should take this discovery to Kingsley immediately. But something made him hesitate. The sheer secrecy of this archive, the fact that it had been sealed away and forgotten rather than destroyed, suggested that powerful people might prefer these secrets to remain buried. Arthur carefully photographed several key pages with a magical camera he kept in his pocket, a habit from the war years, and began organizing the files he most needed to study further. He would take nothing from this room, not yet. That would be theft, officially speaking, even if he suspected he was one of the few people who remembered this archive existed. But he would return, would spend as many late evenings as necessary to understand what had been built and why. As he prepared to leave, his eye caught on one more file, partially hidden beneath others on a lower shelf. The tab read simply, Active Status, 1998. Arthur's heart lurched. 1998, the year Voldemort fell. With shaking hands, he pulled the file and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, the ink still dark and fresh-looking despite the years. The message was brief. Phase 1 successfully completed. Convergence nodes embedded and operational within London electrical grid. Phase 2 protocols remain sealed, pending authorization. Emergency activation sequence keyed to catastrophic magical event. Network will remain dormant unless triggered. Recommend full decommission and memory modification of all involved Muggle personnel within 6 months. The document was unsigned and undated, but the handwriting was shaky, as though written in great haste or under great stress. Arthur read it 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. Whatever had been built was still there, still embedded in London's electrical infrastructure, still capable of activation. And it had been designed to respond to catastrophic magical events. Exactly the kind of events that had occurred repeatedly during Voldemort's Second War. He thought about the Battle of Hogwarts, about the massive expenditure of magical energy during those terrible hours. He thought about the chaos in the months that followed, the wild magic that had surged and ebbed as the wizarding world struggled to find equilibrium again. Had these convergence nodes detected those events? Had some dormant system begun to wake? The question swirled in Arthur's mind as he carefully returned the file to its place, extinguished the lamp with a whispered command, and slipped back out into the corridor. The cabinet slid back into position with surprising ease, as though they too were ready to keep their secrets a little longer. As Arthur made his way back through the silent ministry, past the memorial in the atrium and out into the cold November night, he carried with him the weight of discovery. His fascination with Muggles, long dismissed as an endearing quirk, had led him to something that might prove crucial. Somewhere in London, hidden in plain sight within the mundane world of electrical substations and power grids, a magical weapon lay dormant. And Arthur Weasley, gentle soul and loving father, brilliant mind too often overlooked, knew that he would need to find it before someone else did. The night air was crisp and clear, stars visible above the London rooftops in a way they rarely were. Arthur paused before disapparating, looking up at those distant lights, thinking about the hidden connections that linked all things, magical and Muggle, visible and invisible, past and future. "Well," he murmured to himself, a small smile touching his lips despite his concern, "this is going to require some investigation." And with that characteristic understatement, Arthur Weasley turned and vanished with a soft pop, leaving the Ministry behind, the archive's secrets burning bright in his memory, and the first stirrings of an adventure he could not yet imagine beginning to unfold. Dear listener, rest now, knowing that our gentle hero has begun his quest. Tomorrow's discoveries can wait. For now, let the image of that hidden archive, with its glowing lamp and decades of secrets, fade softly into the peaceful darkness of sleep. Arthur's journey has begun, and we shall follow it together. But for tonight, let these mysteries drift into dreams, soft as owls' wings through moonlit air. The first surge happened on a Tuesday evening, as London's streetlights flickered in patterns no Muggle engineer could explain, and Arthur Weasley sat in his cluttered office at the Ministry, surrounded by copies of files that officially didn't exist. 3 days had passed since his discovery of the hidden archive, 3 days during which he had spent every available hour poring over documents, making notes, and trying to understand the full scope of what Project Convergence had actually built. The files were maddeningly incomplete, full of technical jargon that straddled the line between magical theory and Muggle electrical engineering in ways that made Arthur's head spin with delight and frustration in equal measure. He had filled 2 notebooks with observations, sketches of the runic patterns he'd seen in those grainy photographs, and questions, so many questions, that seemed to multiply faster than he could answer them. It was Perkins who brought him the evening edition of the Daily Prophet, dropping it on Arthur's desk with a concerned expression on his weathered face. "Thought you might want to see this, Arthur," the old wizard said quietly, "given your interests." The headline was buried on page 7, easily overlooked amid the usual coverage of post-war reconstruction and political reorganization. Mysterious power fluctuations baffle Muggle authorities. Arthur felt his stomach drop as he read the brief article. Multiple London neighbourhoods had experienced simultaneous electrical disturbances the previous evening. Lights flickering in synchronized patterns, electronic devices behaving erratically, and, in one case, a complete power station shutdown that had lasted exactly 7 minutes before service inexplicably restored itself. Muggle authorities were quoted as being mystified by the event, particularly because their monitoring equipment showed energy spikes that shouldn't have been possible with their infrastructure. The article's author, clearly amused by Muggle confusion, suggested it was probably just a fault in their peculiar electrical contraptions, nothing for the wizarding world to concern itself with. But Arthur knew better. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out the schematic he'd copied from the archive, the one showing the locations of the convergence nodes embedded throughout London's electrical grid. He overlaid it with a Muggle map of the city he'd obtained from a bookshop in Charing Cross Road, raising more than a few eyebrows with his enthusiastic questions about power distribution networks, and felt his breath catch. Every single neighbourhood mentioned in the Prophet article corresponded exactly to a node location on the Project Convergence map. Arthur sat back in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. The archive had mentioned an emergency activation sequence keyed to catastrophic, magical event. The Battle of Hogwarts had been 8 months ago now, but magical disturbances often had delayed effects, particularly with complex enchantments. Perhaps the system had been slowly waking up, responding to the massive surge of magic that had occurred during Voldemort's final defeat. Or perhaps something else was triggering it, something more deliberate. He needed to see one of these sites for himself, not as a ministry official on some vague inspection tour, but properly, with the kind of access that would let him examine the actual infrastructure. The thought of it made his heart beat faster with that familiar excitement. The prospect of exploring Muggle technology, of seeing how magic and electricity had been woven together, was almost intoxicating. But he would need to be careful. The archive had been hidden for a reason, and the warning in that final file about memory modification of all involved Muggle personnel suggested that people had been willing to go to extreme lengths to keep this secret. If Arthur started asking the wrong questions in the wrong places, someone might notice. Still, he had one advantage. Everyone knew Arthur Weasley was eccentric about Muggles. His fascination was so well established, so openly acknowledged, that a certain amount of odd behaviour would be dismissed as simply Arthur being Arthur. It was a kind of camouflage, he realised, with wry amusement. His reputation as a harmless enthusiast might actually protect him while he investigated something decidedly not harmless. The next morning, Arthur dressed with particular care, choosing his most conservatively styled Muggle suit, the one Molly had helped him select for Harry and Ginny's wedding. He checked his reflection in the small mirror in his office, adjusting his tie, a cheerful yellow with small snitches embroidered on it, a gift from Ron, and making sure his Muggle money was properly organised. Then he apparated to a quiet alley near King's Cross and set off on foot toward the first convergence node location, an electrical substation in Islington. The walk took him through streets that were properly awake now, the morning rush of Muggle London in full flow. Arthur loved this, the sheer energy of the non-magical world, the way people hurried past with their briefcases and newspapers, completely unaware of the magical community existing alongside them. He passed coffee shops where people queued for elaborate drinks with names he couldn't quite pronounce, dodged around a man talking animatedly into one of those mobile telephone devices, and paused at a traffic light, watching with genuine fascination as the coloured signals controlled the flow of vehicles. The substation was housed in an unremarkable brick building, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. Warning signs proclaimed "Danger, High Voltage, and Authorized Personnel Only" in stern red letters. Arthur stood across the street, pretending to consult a small notebook while actually examining the building with every sense he possessed. There, just visible above the roofline, he could see it. a pattern in the brickwork that wasn't quite random, a subtle arrangement that his trained eye recognized immediately as the outer edge of a runic array. The runes were disguised, worked into the building structure in a way that would be invisible to Muggles and easily overlooked even by wizards who weren't looking for them. But they were there, and they were active. Arthur could feel the faint thrumming of magical energy, like a low vibration at the edge of perception. "Can I help you, mate?" Arthur jumped, spinning to find a Muggle man in a high-visibility vest, watching him with mild suspicion. The man was probably in his 50s, with oil-stained hands and the weathered look of someone who worked with machinery for a living. "Oh, yes, hello," Arthur said, summoning his brightest, most harmless smile. "I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I'm doing a bit of research on electrical infrastructure, amateur historian, you see, and I was wondering if you might tell me about this facility." The man's expression shifted from suspicious to bemused. "Electrical infrastructure? That's a new one. Most people just walk right past." He glanced at the substation with the fond exasperation of long familiarity. Not much to tell, really. It's a distribution point, takes the high voltage from the main grid and steps it down for the local area. Been here since the 70s, far as I know. The 70s? Arthur's enthusiasm was entirely genuine. How fascinating, and has it been reliable? Any unusual behavior over the years? The man scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, funny you should mention it. We've been having some odd readings lately. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but the monitoring equipment's been showing these little spikes, regular as clockwork, every few days. Engineers can't figure out where they're coming from. Power output is normal. Everything tests fine, but there's these echoes, I suppose you would call them, like the system is humming to itself." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, despite the morning warmth. "How long has this been happening? Started maybe 6, 7 months ago? Hard to say exactly. Could have been going on longer, and we just didn't notice until it got more pronounced." The man shrugged. "They've sent specialists in, checked every transformer, every cable. Everything's in perfect working order, which makes it all the stranger. 6 or 7 months. Right around the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, allowing for the kind of delayed magical response Arthur had theorized." He forced himself to maintain his cheerful, curious expression, even as his mind raced. "How very peculiar. And you said it happens on a regular schedule?" "Every 72 hours, near as we can tell. Like something's waking up to check the time, then going back to sleep." The man laughed at his own whimsy. "My colleague thinks it's some kind of feedback loop in the system, but that doesn't really explain it either." 72 hours, 3 days. Arthur thought about magical harmonics, about the way complex enchantments often cycled through patterns based on numerologically significant intervals. 3 was a powerful number in magic, used in everything from potion brewing to curse breaking. If the convergence nodes were running on a 3-day cycle, that suggested they were following magical logic, not electrical engineering principles. "Absolutely fascinating," Arthur said, meaning every word. "Thank you so much for your time. You've been tremendously helpful." The man smiled, clearly pleased to have an audience for his observations. "No trouble at all. Always nice to meet someone interested in the work. Most people don't give a second thought to where their electricity comes from, do they?" As Arthur walked away, His mind was already planning his next steps. He needed to visit more of the node locations, needed to see if the pattern held across the network. But more than that, he needed help, expertise he didn't possess. The magical theory underlying this project was sophisticated, far beyond his own understanding. And the potential implications if these nodes continued to activate, if they moved beyond simple echoes to whatever Phase 2 was supposed to be. He thought about Harry and Hermione. Harry, who had faced down Voldemort himself and understood better than anyone the stakes of hidden dangers. Hermione, whose brilliant analytical mind could untangle complex problems with a speed and thoroughness that left Arthur in awe. They had earned their peace after the war, earned the right to build quiet lives free from constant peril. But they also deserved to know if a new threat was emerging, particularly one that bridged the magical and Muggle worlds in ways that could endanger both. Arthur spent the rest of the day visiting 4 more node locations scattered across London. Each one told the same story. Unremarkable Muggle electrical infrastructure hiding carefully disguised runic arrays, all of them active, all of them cycling on that same 72-hour pattern. At the 3rd site, he managed to convince a bemused security guard to let him take photographs for my research, capturing images of the buildings from multiple angles. Later, in the privacy of a small park, he used a magical enhancement charm to reveal the hidden runes in the photographs, confirming what his eyes had seen. By the time evening fell and Arthur made his way back to the ministry, his notebook was filled with observations and his camera held evidence that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat in the growing darkness, thinking about secrets and responsibilities and the weight of knowledge. The lamp on his desk cast a warm circle of light as he pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write. Not an official report. Not yet. Not until he understood more. But a letter, carefully worded, asking Harry and Hermione if they might have time to visit the Burrow this weekend. Molly would be delighted to see them, he wrote, and there was something he'd like to discuss with them if they had a moment. Nothing urgent, just something that had come up in his work that he thought they might find interesting. His quill paused over the parchment. That last part was true, at least. They would find it interesting. They would also understand immediately that when Arthur Weasley described something as interesting in that particular tone, it usually meant he'd stumbled onto something significant. He sealed the letter with wax, pressing his signet ring into the soft seal, and sent it off with the ministry's evening post. Then he sat back, looking at the photographs spread across his desk, at the notebook filled with technical observations and magical theory, at the copied files from the archive that officially didn't exist. Outside his window, London glowed with electric light. Millions of Muggles going about their evening routines, completely unaware that threaded through their city's infrastructure was a magical network that had been waiting, patient and dormant, for nearly 20 years. Waiting for what? Arthur still wasn't certain. But the fact that it was waking up now, responding to some stimulus with those regular pulses of activation, meant that time was not on his side. He thought about the final file in the archive, the one that had mentioned Phase 2 protocols remain sealed pending authorization. What happened if the system completed Phase 1? What did Phase 2 entail? The files had spoken of both defensive and offensive applications, of channeling magical energy on an unprecedented scale. In the wrong hands, or even in the right hands, but at the wrong time, such power could be catastrophic. Arthur reached for the photograph showing the industrial facility from the archive, the one with the cooling towers and the impossible hybrid structure. He studied it under the lamplight, noting details he'd missed before. The way the shadows fell suggested the photo had been taken at dawn or dusk, the presence of what looked like ministry security barriers in the background. The fact that one of the cooling towers had what appeared to be a massive runic inscription carved into its concrete surface. This facility had to be the central hub, the place where all the convergence nodes connected. And if it still existed somewhere, it would hold the answers he needed, the full technical specifications, the activation protocols, perhaps even the ability to shut the system down safely before Phase 2 could begin. Finding it would be his next task. But first, he needed allies. He needed people he could trust absolutely, people who understood that some secrets, once uncovered, demanded action rather than comfortable silence. Arthur stood, stretching his back. He'd been sitting hunched over his desk for hours and began organizing his materials. The archive would still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently in its sealed room behind filing cabinets that most people didn't know could be moved. The convergence nodes would continue their 72-hour cycle, humming their electric magical song beneath London's streets. And somewhere, encoded in all this technical complexity, was a truth that Arthur suspected would change everything. But tonight, he would go home to Molly, would eat her cooking, and listen to her talk about Ginny's latest Quidditch match, and Ron and Hermione's upcoming visit. And he would hold close to his heart the knowledge that his fascination with Muggles, that gentle, often mocked obsession, had led him to discover something that truly mattered. Tomorrow, the investigation would continue. Tomorrow, he would begin to share this burden with others. But, for tonight, Arthur Weasley allowed himself a small, satisfied smile as he extinguished his lamp and prepared to disapparate home. The game, as they said, was afoot. And this time, it was a game that required exactly his particular combination of skills: magical knowledge, Muggle understanding, and the patient, methodical curiosity that had always been his greatest strength. Dear listener, let these mysteries settle gently in your mind as you drift toward sleep. Picture Arthur walking through London's streets, his notebooks filled with secrets, his heart full of purpose. The convergence nodes pulse in their 72-hour rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness, answers wait to be discovered. But all of that can wait for tomorrow. For now, rest easy, knowing that gentle Arthur is on the case, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs. Arthur knew he couldn't pursue this alone, and there were only two people he trusted completely, with secrets that bridged both worlds. 3, if you counted his own son. But Ron came as part of the package these days, inseparable from Hermione in all the ways that mattered most. The letter he'd sent had been deliberately casual, but when Harry's reply arrived by owl on Thursday morning, the response told Arthur everything he needed to know. Of course, we'll come for Sunday lunch. Looking forward to whatever you want to discuss. H. Short, direct, and with an undertone of understanding that made Arthur's heart warm with gratitude. The days until Sunday passed with agonizing slowness. Arthur continued his work at the ministry, maintained his careful facade of normal routine, and spent his evenings in the hidden archive, methodically working through more files. He found additional documentation that made his discoveries both more concrete and more troubling. Installation records showing exactly when each convergence node had been embedded in the Muggle electrical infrastructure. Payment receipts for memory modifications performed on Muggle engineers. And most chillingly, a technical manual that outlined emergency protocols for full network activation in response to existential magical threat. The manual was dense with terminology that straddled magical and Muggle science, but Arthur's patient study began to reveal its secrets. The convergence nodes formed a network, a web of interconnected points that could channel and amplify magical energy by running it through the Muggle electrical grid. The theory, as far as Arthur could understand it, was that magical energy and electromagnetic energy were fundamentally related, different expressions of the same underlying force. By carefully tuning the runic arrays to resonate with specific electrical frequencies, the system could use London's entire power infrastructure as a massive, magical amplifier. What troubled Arthur most was a single paragraph buried deep in the technical specifications. Once Phase 2 activation begins, network will achieve autonomous operation. Manual shutdown protocols will be ineffective. System designed to run completion sequence regardless of external intervention. Estimated duration of full discharge, 96 hours, 4 days. If Phase 2 activated, whatever it was designed to do would run for 4 days, and nothing could stop it. The implications made Arthur's blood run cold. Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made the burrow look like something from a painting. Golden leaves drifted from the orchard trees. The garden gnomes were engaged in their usual territorial disputes, and Molly had been cooking since dawn, filling the house with smells that made Arthur's stomach rumble despite his preoccupation. She was happy. Genuinely happy in a way she hadn't been since before the war, at the prospect of having Harry, Ron, and Hermione all together around her table again. Arthur had asked her casually if she minded if he borrowed them for a chat after lunch, something about work that might interest them. Molly had given him one of her knowing looks, the kind that suggested she understood more than she let on, but had simply kissed his cheek and told him not to keep them too long, as she wanted time with Hermione to discuss wedding plans. They arrived promptly at noon, apparating into the garden with the ease of people who had done so countless times. Harry looked well, Arthur noted with quiet satisfaction. The haunted shadows that had lingered in his eyes for months after the war had finally begun to fade. He wore Muggle clothes, jeans and a simple jacket, and he smiled with genuine warmth as he embraced Molly. Ron was talking animatedly about something to do with the Aura training program, his face alight with enthusiasm. And Hermione, brilliant Hermione, caught Arthur's eye over the general hubbub of greetings and gave him a small, significant nod. She knew. Of course she knew. Arthur had learned long ago never to underestimate Hermione Granger's ability to read between the lines. Lunch was a raucous, joyful affair. Molly had outdone herself. Roast chicken with all the trimmings, followed by treacle tart and custard. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from Ginny's upcoming match against the Holyhead Harpies to George's latest product innovations at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. For a few precious hours, Arthur let himself simply enjoy the warmth of family, the sound of laughter, the way Harry's hand found Ginny's under the table, and the way Ron and Hermione finished each other's sentences. But eventually, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the kitchen windows, and Molly shooed them out so she could clean up in peace, Arthur led Harry, Ron, and Hermione to his workshop, the cluttered shed at the bottom of the garden where he'd spent countless hours tinkering with Muggle artifacts and indulging his fascination with how things worked. The shed was exactly as chaotic as always. Shelves overflowing with dismantled toasters, several cars in various states of mechanical dissection, a collection of batteries that Arthur was studying with great interest, and, incongruously, a neat table he'd cleared specifically for this meeting. On the table lay his notebooks, his photographs, and carefully selected copies of the most crucial archive files. "Right," Ron said, looking around with familiar affection. "What's all this then, Dad? You look like you're planning to rob Gringotts again." Arthur managed a smile. "Nothing quite so dramatic, I hope. But I have stumbled onto something rather concerning, and I need your help, all of you, to figure out what to do about it." He saw them shift immediately, the casual afternoon atmosphere evaporating as they read the seriousness in his tone. Harry's hand moved unconsciously toward his wand pocket. Hermione stepped closer to the table, her sharp eyes already scanning the documents spread there. Ron's expression settled into the determined focus that Arthur had seen during the war, the look of a young man who had faced terrible dangers and would face them again if necessary. 3 weeks ago, Arthur began, choosing his words with care, I discovered a hidden archive in the Department of Mysteries. It contained documentation of a project that shouldn't exist, decades of secret collaboration between rogue wizards and Muggle corporations, all centered around something called Project Convergence. He laid out the story methodically, showing them the files, explaining the convergence nodes embedded in London's electrical infrastructure, describing his visits to the sites and the regular 72-hour activation cycle. Harry and Ron listened with growing alarm, but it was Hermione who picked up the technical manual, her fingers tracing over the complex diagrams with a speed that suggested her mind was already racing ahead. "This is extraordinary," she breathed, her voice mixing awe with horror. "They've created a hybrid system that uses the Muggle electrical grid as a magical conduit. The theoretical implications alone." She looked up, her eyes wide. "Arthur, if this works the way these specifications suggest, it could channel magical energy on a scale we've never seen. The amount of power running through London's grid at any given moment is enormous. Gigawatts of electrical energy. If you could convert even a fraction of that into focused magical force, it would be like having thousands of wizards all casting the same spell simultaneously," Harry said quietly. "All that power, all directed at a single purpose." "Exactly." Arthur nodded, grateful for their quick understanding. The files describe both defensive and offensive applications. I believe it was originally conceived as a weapon against Voldemort, a failsafe if magical defenses weren't enough. But here's what troubles me most. He pulled out the page describing Phase 2. The system appears to be activating on its own. Those surges I mentioned, the ones happening every 72 hours. They're getting stronger. I think the Battle of Hogwarts triggered something. All that magical energy released at once. The convergence nodes are waking up. Hermione was already making notes, her quill flying across a blank sheet of parchment. The battle was 8 months ago. If there's a progressive activation sequence, we need to establish a timeline. When did the surges start exactly? How much has the intensity increased? Is there a predictable progression toward this Phase 2 activation? I don't know, Arthur admitted. The Muggle engineers first noticed the anomalies about 6 or 7 months ago, but they could have been happening at lower levels before that. What I do know is that once Phase 2 begins, it runs for 96 hours and cannot be manually stopped. Whatever the system is designed to do, once it starts, we're committed to seeing it through. Ron had picked up one of the photographs, the one showing the mysterious industrial facility. What's this place? I think it's the central hub, Arthur said, where all the convergence nodes connect. If we're going to understand how to control this system or shut it down, we need to find that facility. But I have no idea where it is. The photograph has no identifying features, and the files don't include an address. Harry leaned over to look at the photograph, and Arthur saw something shift in his expression. That particular intensity that meant Harry was remembering something. Those cooling towers, Harry said slowly. I've seen them before, during the war, when we were moving around. There's a decommissioned power station northeast of London, near the coast, Muggle facility, that was shut down in the 80s. We hid there for a night once. He glanced at Ron and Hermione, who both nodded. It felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but odd, like there was magic there that didn't quite fit. Hermione was already pulling out her own wand, conjuring a map of England that shimmered in the air above the table. Can you show us approximately where? Harry studied the map, then pointed to an area along the Thames estuary. Somewhere around here. There were these massive cooling towers, visible for miles, and the whole place had this abandoned feel, but the security was still active. Muggle warning signs everywhere, fences that looked too well maintained for a derelict site. Because it wasn't really derelict, Hermione said, her voice tight with understanding. It was being kept secure. Probably had Muggle repelling charms layered over it. Notice me not enchantments. Anyone who tried to explore would suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. Arthur felt a surge of hope. If you could find it again, if we could get inside and examine the actual control systems, we could understand what we're dealing with, Hermione finished. See if there's a way to safely deactivate the network before Phase 2 initiates. She paused, her expression troubled. But Arthur, you mentioned pressure from within the Ministry. Who else knows about this? This was the part Arthur had been dreading. I don't know. The archive was sealed and forgotten, but someone had to authorize that sealing. Someone decided these secrets should be buried rather than destroyed. And when I first started asking questions, very carefully, very obliquely, about historical Ministry projects involving Muggle technology, I noticed certain reactions. What kind of reactions? Ron asked, his voice taking in the professional tone he used as an Aura trainee. Senior officials changing the subject. Files that should be accessible suddenly requiring higher clearance. And 2 days ago, I found a surveillance charm on my office door. Someone is watching to see what I'm investigating." The shed fell silent, except for the distant sound of gnomes arguing in the garden, and the gentle ticking of a Muggle clock Arthur had been studying. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged glances, and Arthur saw a familiar communication happening between them, the silent language of people who had fought side by side, who trusted each other absolutely. "Right," Harry said finally. "So we need to be careful. No official channels, no involving the Ministry until we know what we're dealing with and who we can trust." "We investigate the facility," Hermione added, her tone becoming briskly practical. "Gather evidence, understand the system, then we decide on next steps." "And we watch each other's backs," Ron said, looking at his father with an expression that made Arthur's heart swell. "Because if someone in the Ministry wants this buried badly enough to surveil you, they might be willing to do more if they think we're getting close to the truth." Arthur felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. For 3 weeks, he'd been alone with this knowledge, uncertain whether his concerns were justified, or if he was overreacting to what might be a harmless anomaly. But here, in his cluttered shed, with these 3 remarkable young people, looking at him with trust and determination, he knew he'd made the right choice. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you. I know you've earned your peace. I know the last thing any of you need is another crisis. But, Arthur," Hermione interrupted gently, "you didn't create this situation. You're just the one brave enough to investigate it rather than look the other way. That's what makes you remarkable." "Besides," Ron added with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "when has life ever let us have peace for long? Might as well face trouble with family." Harry was studying the map again, his expression distant in the way that meant he was planning. "We should scout the facility soon. This week, if possible. If the activation cycle is every 72 hours and the intensity is increasing, we don't have time to waste." "I agree," Hermione said. "Arthur, when is the next surge scheduled?" Arthur consulted his notebook. "Based on the pattern, Tuesday evening, around 9 o'clock. "Then we go Wednesday," Harry decided. "Give the system time to settle back to dormant state. Less chance of accidentally triggering something if we're examining it during an inactive phase." They spent the next hour planning in detail. Hermione made lists. She always made lists of equipment they'd need, spells that might be useful, research she wanted to do in the Ministry Library about magical electrical theory. Ron focused on security concerns, talking through approach strategies and escape routes with the tactical mind he'd developed as an aura. Harry studied the photographs Arthur had taken, memorizing details, comparing them with his memory of the facility he'd seen during the war. As the autumn sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, they wrapped up their planning. Arthur gathered his materials carefully, already thinking about what additional documentation he should pull from the archive before Wednesday. But as they prepared to return to the house, Molly would be wondering what was taking so long. Hermione touched his arm. "Arthur, there's something else we need to consider," she said, her voice low. "If this system was designed as a weapon against Voldemort, and if it's activating now in response to the magical energy from the Battle of Hogwarts, it's possible that it's not actually malfunctioning. It might be doing exactly what it was designed to do." Arthur felt ice in his stomach. You think it's meant to activate after Voldemort's defeat? I think we need to consider all possibilities, Hermione said carefully, including the possibility that someone anticipated the need for a massive discharge of magical energy in the aftermath of his fall. The question is, discharge it to do what? That question hung in the air as they made their way back to the burrow, where Molly had tea and cake waiting, and Ginny had arrived to hear about training camp. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable family warmth, but Arthur couldn't quite shake Hermione's words from his mind. Later, as he and Molly prepared for bed, she asked him quietly if everything was all right. Arthur kissed her forehead and told her the truth. He'd found something at work that needed investigation, but he had good help, and everything would be fine. She looked at him with those knowing eyes that had seen him through so many years, through so many crises, both small and large, and simply held his hand. "Just be careful, Arthur Weasley," she whispered. "We've had enough danger for one lifetime." "I will," he promised. And as he drifted off to sleep, Arthur thought about the strange path his fascination with Muggles had led him down. From harmless tinkering with rubber ducks and batteries to uncovering secrets that might determine the safety of both worlds. Not all threats come from dark wizards. Sometimes they wear the robes of bureaucracy and speak in measured tones of caution, their words wrapped in the silk of institutional concern, while their eyes carry the cold calculation of those who have much to protect. Arthur learned this truth on Monday morning when he arrived at his office to find Yaxley waiting for him. Not the Death Eater Yaxley who had been imprisoned after the war, but his younger cousin Marcus, a senior official in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who had spent the war years keeping his head down and his loyalties carefully ambiguous. "Arthur," Marcus said smoothly, rising from Arthur's chair, an invasion of personal space that was clearly intentional. "I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of waiting inside. We need to have a conversation." Arthur set his briefcase down carefully, his mind already racing through possibilities. The surveillance charm on his door had been discovered and removed on Thursday. Someone had noticed. He kept his expression pleasantly confused, the mild-mannered ministry employee surprised by an unexpected visit. "Marcus, good morning." "Of course. Please, sit. What can I do for you?" Marcus didn't sit. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out over the atrium below, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose that suggested authority and control. "I've been hearing interesting things about your recent activities, Arthur. Late nights in the Department of Mysteries. Questions about historical projects involving Muggle technology. Unusual interest in London's electrical infrastructure." He turned, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "One might wonder what you're looking for." "Research," Arthur said easily, settling into his own chair and beginning to unpack his briefcase with deliberate calm. "Part of my restoration work involves understanding all the projects the ministry has undertaken over the years. Can't properly reorganize if we don't know what we have, can we?" "Indeed." Marcus moved closer to the desk, his fingers trailing across the surface in a gesture that felt threatening despite its casualness. "The thing is, Arthur, some projects are best left in the past. The war is over. We're rebuilding. The last thing anyone needs is someone digging up old controversies, asking questions that might complicate the healing process." Arthur looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze steadily. What controversies would those be? For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's expression. Calculation, perhaps, or a reassessment. You're an intelligent man, Arthur? Don't play naive. Projects that involved questionable collaborations, that pushed the boundaries of the statute of secrecy, that made certain influential people uncomfortable. The kind of things that are better left forgotten. The kind of things that involved embedding magical weapons in Muggle infrastructure? Arthur asked quietly. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus's face went carefully blank, the mask of bureaucratic pleasantness slipping to reveal something harder underneath. I don't know what you think you found, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. But I would strongly advise you to stop looking. For your own good, Arthur. For your family's good. The implied threat sent ice through Arthur's veins, but he forced himself to remain calm. Is that an official warning? Consider it friendly advice from a concerned colleague. Marcus moved towards the door, then paused. The archive you've been visiting, the one behind the filing cabinets in the Department of Mystery's basement. It's scheduled for reassignment. Next Monday, actually. Everything in it will be transferred to secure storage pending review, after which I imagine most of it will be deemed unnecessary, to retain and disposed of appropriately. Destroyed. They were going to destroy the evidence. Arthur kept his face neutral, but his mind was working frantically. 6 days. He had 6 days before the archive disappeared forever. I see, Arthur said mildly. Thank you for letting me know. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then shook his head with what might have been genuine regret. You're a good man, Arthur. You love your family. You've lost one son already. The reminder of Fred was like a physical blow. Don't lose more by pursuing ghosts that won't stay buried. Some secrets serve a purpose. Sometimes, institutional memory loss is a feature, not a bug. And with that, he left, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded more ominous than a slam. Arthur sat motionless for several minutes, his heart pounding, his mind racing through the implications. The surveillance charm. Marcus's visit. The scheduled destruction of the archive. Someone, multiple someones, probably knew exactly what he was investigating and wanted him to stop. The threat to his family had been veiled, but unmistakable. He thought about backing off, about taking Marcus's friendly advice and returning to safe, mundane work. He thought about Molly, about his surviving children, about the grandchildren he hoped to see someday. He had already lost Fred. Could he risk losing more? But then he thought about those convergence nodes pulsing beneath London, about Phase 2 and its unstoppable 96-hour sequence, about the fact that someone in the ministry wanted this buried badly enough to threaten a colleague. And he thought about what Hermione had said, that the system might be doing exactly what it was designed to do, which meant they needed to understand it before it was too late. Arthur pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write. Not a report, not yet, but a detailed summary of everything he'd learned, everything he suspected, to be sealed and stored somewhere safe. If something happened to him, if the archive was destroyed and Marcus or his allies succeeded in burying this secret, at least there would be a record. He was halfway through when a soft knock on his door made him jump. His wand was in his hand instantly, instincts from the war that had never quite faded, but the voice that called through the door was familiar and welcome. "Arthur, it's Hermione. Can I come in?" He opened the door quickly, pulling her inside and casting a privacy charm with a flick of his wand. Hermione's eyes widened at the precaution, but she didn't question it. Instead, she set down the large bag she'd been carrying and looked at him with concern. "I've been doing research," she said without preamble. "I spent all day yesterday in the Ministry Library, and I found something you need to see. But first, are you all right? You look pale." Arthur told her about Marcus's visit, watching her expression shift from concern to anger to cold, analytical calculation. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, her brilliant mind clearly working through possibilities. "They're scared," she said finally, "which means we're on to something significant. The question is, what are they scared of? Exposure? Legal consequences? Or is there something about the convergent system itself that they're trying to hide?" "I don't know, but Marcus implied that influential people were made uncomfortable by the original project. People whose families are presumably still influential now." Hermione nodded slowly. "I found records of a classified committee that existed from 1975 to 1980, called the Strategic Defense Initiative Working Group. It was disbanded abruptly in January 1980, right around the time the war with Voldemort was intensifying. The membership list is sealed, but I did find one interesting detail. The committee's charter was to explore unconventional approaches to existential threats facing the wizarding world. "Project Convergence," Arthur breathed. "Almost certainly. And look at this." She pulled a sheaf of parchment from her bag. Financial records, publicly available but buried in archived budgets. In 1979, the ministry allocated an enormous sum, we're talking millions of galleons, to something listed only as Infrastructure Hardening Initiative. The money was distributed through a shell organization that has since been dissolved. But I traced the board members. 3 of them have children or close relatives currently serving in senior ministry positions. Arthur took the parchment, scanning the names. He recognized several. Department heads, influential advisors, people with the power to make careers or break them. So, the families who profited from the original project are now in positions to protect that secret. It's worse than that. Hermione's voice was grim. I found oblique references in some old Prophet articles from 1980 to 1981. Nothing explicit, but there were accusations floating around about ministry corruption, about secret deals with Muggle businesses. The stories died quickly, probably suppressed, but the implication is that some ministry officials were lining their pockets while supposedly building defenses against Voldemort. "They were embezzling," Arthur said slowly, understanding dawning. "They created a legitimate defense project as cover, took ministry funds meant for protecting the wizarding world, and siphoned off money for themselves through contracts with Muggle corporations. Some of those corporations probably didn't even exist except on paper." "Exactly. Which means that if the full truth about Project Convergence comes out, it's not just an embarrassing historical footnote. It's evidence of massive corruption during wartime, potentially implicating families that are still powerful today." Hermione's eyes blazed with righteous anger. They let people believe the ministry was fully committed to fighting Voldemort while they were stealing funds. How many lives might have been saved if that money had gone to actual defenses? The scope of it made Arthur feel sick. He thought about all the people who had died in the First War, about the Order of the Phoenix operating on shoestring budgets, while ministry officials grew rich off the fear their deaths inspired. He thought about Fred, about Tonks and Lupin, about all the losses in the Second War that might have been prevented if the wizarding world had been better prepared. "We need to document everything," he said quietly. "Not just the convergence system, but the financial trail, the corruption, all of it. Even if they destroy the archive, even if they try to silence us, there needs to be a record. Already on it." Hermione pulled out more parchment, her handwriting covering every inch in her characteristic thoroughness. "I've been making copies of everything I find. I'm storing them in 3 separate locations, including one in the Muggle world where ministry officials can't easily access them. And I've written to some people I trust, former members of Dumbledore's army, to let them know that if anything happens to us, they should look into Project Convergence." Arthur felt a rush of affection for this remarkable young woman who had become like a daughter to him. "You've been busy." "I don't like bullies," Hermione said simply. "And I especially don't like corrupt officials who threaten good people for trying to do the right thing. Marcus Yaxley and whoever he's working with made a mistake when they threatened you, Arthur. They assumed you'd back down. They didn't count on you having friends who are very good at uncovering secrets." A soft tap on the window made them both jump. Arthur opened it to find Ron's owl, Pigwidgeon, carrying a note. Arthur unrolled it quickly. "Dad, Harry says he found the facility. We're ready to go Wednesday as planned, but after what Hermione told me about the archive being destroyed next week, maybe we should move faster. Can you get everything you need from there by tomorrow?" "Ron." Arthur and Hermione exchanged glances. "Tonight," Arthur decided. "I'll go back tonight and photograph everything. Every file, every document, every memory file. It'll take hours, but we can't risk losing it." "I'll help," Hermione said immediately. "2 of us working together can cover twice as much ground, and I can cast some very effective notice-me-not charms. Anyone who checks will think the archive is empty and undisturbed." They made plans quickly. Hermione would meet him at the ministry at 10 o'clock, after most of the staff had gone home. They would work through the night if necessary, documenting everything before the archive could be reassigned. And Wednesday morning, exhausted or not, they would join Harry and Ron for the expedition to the facility. The rest of Monday passed in a haze of routine work and careful paranoia. Arthur noticed several colleagues watching him with unusual interest. A memo requesting his presence at a routine security review appeared on his desk, scheduled for Tuesday afternoon, which would conveniently keep him away from the archive during normal working hours. He sent back a polite reply saying he would attend, knowing he had no intention of doing so. That evening, as planned, Hermione arrived at the ministry wearing a carefully unremarkable set of work robes and carrying what appeared to be a standard ministry briefcase. To anyone watching, she was just a young employee working late, perhaps researching for an upcoming trial. They met in the atrium, exchanged the briefest of nods, and made their way separately to the Department of Mysteries. The corridors were nearly empty at this hour, lit by torches that burned with steady, eternal flames. Their footsteps echoed on stone floors as they descended deeper into the building, past offices dark and silent, past doors sealed with powerful enchantments, down to the basement level where the archive waited. Arthur moved the filing cabinets aside with more confidence this time, revealing the unmarked door. It opened at his touch. and he and Hermione slipped inside, closing it carefully behind them. The enchanted lamp flickered to life, welcoming them into the room full of secrets. "Oh my," Hermione breathed, looking around at the shelves packed with files. "This is going to take a while." They worked with quiet efficiency, developing a system quickly. Arthur pulled files and opened them, while Hermione used a magical camera to photograph each page, her wand work precise and economical. They spoke little, communicating mostly in gestures, both hyper-aware that they were engaged in something that could have serious consequences if discovered. The hours slipped past. Midnight came and went. Arthur's back ached from bending over files, and his eyes burned from reading faded text in the lamplight. But he pressed on. This was important. This mattered. Each photograph they took was evidence, was truth, was protection, against those who would prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable history. Around 2 a.m, Hermione made a small sound of discovery. "Arthur, look at this." She held out a file marked Phase 2 Implementation Protocols. Inside were technical specifications that made Arthur's blood run cold. Phase 2 wasn't a defensive measure. It was designed to create a massive surge of magical energy, channeled through the Muggle electrical grid, and then released all at once in what the document called a controlled magical detonation sufficient to collapse all active enchantments within a 50-mile radius. "It's an anti-magic bomb," Arthur said slowly, his mind struggling to process the implications. They built a weapon that would strip away every protective charm, every ward, every enchantment in London. "And leave wizards completely vulnerable," Hermione finished, her face pale. "No magical defenses, no way to disapparate, no protective spells. We'd be as helpless as Muggles for... It says here the effect would last approximately 12 hours before the magical field could reconstitute itself." But why? Arthur couldn't understand the reasoning. Why would anyone build something that would leave us defenseless? Hermione was already flipping through more pages, her analytical mind piecing together the puzzle. "Look, here. It was designed as a last resort against a Voldemort victory. If he had taken over the Ministry completely, if all conventional magical resistance had failed, Phase 2 could be activated. It would strip away his protections, his Horcrux wards, everything, giving non-magical methods, Muggle weapons, a chance to stop him. A scorched earth policy," Arthur said quietly. "Destroy magic itself rather than let him win." "And now it's activating on its own," Hermione said. "Responding to magical energy signatures it's detecting in the aftermath of the battle. We need to understand why, and we need to stop it, because if Phase 2 goes off now..." She didn't need to finish. The chaos of 50 miles of failed enchantments in and around London would be catastrophic. Potions would spoil, magical creatures would be freed from their containment, wards protecting homes and businesses would collapse. People could die. They photographed the Phase 2 protocols with shaking hands, then continued their systematic documentation. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside, they had covered every shelf, every file, every document in the archive. Hermione had filled 4 memory cards for the magical camera, and Arthur had made detailed notes about the organization system so they could find specific information quickly if needed. As they prepared to leave, Hermione took one last look around the room. "They're going to destroy all of this," she said softly. "All this history, all this evidence, just to protect reputations and hide old crimes." "They're going to try," Arthur corrected gently. "But we have copies. and we're not going to let them succeed. They slipped out of the archive, returned the filing cabinets to their position, and made their way back through the silent ministry. Arthur felt exhausted, but grimly satisfied. Whatever happened now, whatever pressure Marcus Yaxley and his allies brought to bear, the truth was preserved. Tuesday passed in a blur. Arthur ignored the security review summons, claiming sudden illness. Not entirely a lie, given how little sleep he'd had. He spent the day organizing the photographs and documents they'd collected, creating a coherent narrative of Project Convergence from its inception through the present danger. Hermione sent copies to her secure locations, and by evening, multiple people outside their immediate circle knew to investigate if anything happened to them. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. Arthur, dressed in practical clothes, gathered the equipment they discussed and met Harry, Ron, and Hermione at a designated apparition point outside London. It was time to visit the facility, to see the heart of the convergent system, and hopefully to find a way to stop Phase 2 before it could activate. But as they stood together in the grey dawn light, preparing to disapparate to the abandoned power station, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That somewhere in the ministry, Marcus Yaxley and his allies were tracking their movements, waiting to see what they would do next. In an abandoned warehouse, where Muggle steel met magical intent, the true nature of the conspiracy finally revealed itself. The facility stood against the grey morning sky like a monument to forgotten ambition, its cooling towers rising stark and massive above the flat marshland of the Thames estuary. Harry had been right. It was impossible to miss once you knew to look for it. Yet somehow the eye wanted to slide away, to find somewhere else to focus. The notice-me-not enchantments were subtle but powerful, woven into the very air around the decommissioned power station. Arthur stood, with Harry, Ron, and Hermione, in the shelter of an old maintenance building, studying the facility through omnioculars that Hermione had modified to detect magical signatures. Through the enhanced lenses, he could see what Muggle eyes would miss: shimmering defensive wards overlaying the perimeter fence, runic arrays carved into the concrete foundations, and a faint golden glow emanating from somewhere deep within the main structure. "It's beautiful," Arthur breathed, his professional fascination momentarily overriding his apprehension. "Look at how they've integrated the magical and Muggle elements. The cooling towers aren't just architectural features. They're actually part of the spell matrix, using the thermal dynamics to help regulate the magical energy flow." "It's also terrifying," Hermione countered, lowering her own omnioculars. "According to the files we photographed, this facility was designed to channel the combined output of all 47 convergence nodes scattered across London. That's an enormous amount of energy." Ron was studying the perimeter with a tactical eye he'd developed as an aura. "Security looks light. Too light, actually. Just basic wards. Nothing like what you'd expect protecting something this important." "Because it's been forgotten," Harry said quietly. "Or at least officially forgotten. The people who built this wanted it kept secret, but they also wanted to be able to access it if needed. Heavy security would attract attention." Arthur considered this. The files mentioned that the facility was disguised as a decommissioned power station, which it actually was, at least partly. The Muggles shut down the electrical generation in 1984, but the magical systems were installed during the conversion process in the 70s. To anyone who bothered to check, it would just look like an abandoned industrial site, waiting for demolition that never quite happens. They spent another 20 minutes observing, noting patrol patterns in the magical wards, and identifying the safest approach. Hermione detected a weak point in the enchantments near what appeared to be an old service entrance, probably degraded by years of neglect. They planned their route carefully, establishing fallback positions and emergency apparition coordinates in case things went wrong. As they prepared to move, Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder. Harry was looking at him with an expression that was both concerned and determined. "Are you sure about this, Arthur? You've got Molly and the kids to think about. We can handle this part if you'd rather." "No." Arthur's voice was gentle but firm. "This is my discovery, my responsibility. And honestly, Harry, I don't think any of you could make sense of the Muggle equipment without me. We're a team, all 4 of us. We go in together." The approach to the facility was nerve-wracking, despite the apparent lack of active security. They moved in single file, Harry leading with his aura training sharp and alert, followed by Ron, then Arthur, with Hermione bringing up the rear and maintaining a web of detection charms around them. The ground was uneven, scattered with rusted metal and broken concrete, and the air smelled of salt from the nearby estuary, mixed with the peculiar metallic tang that Arthur associated with old industrial sites. The service entrance was exactly where Hermione had predicted, a heavy steel door set into the concrete wall of the main building, nearly invisible beneath decades of grime and rust. The Muggle lock had long since seized, but the magical seal was still active, glowing faintly blue when Arthur touched it with his wand. "It's keyed to Ministry identification," Hermione murmured, "running diagnostic spells." "But the enchantment is old, based on protocols that haven't been used since the 80s. I think I can fool it with a modified authentication charm." She worked with quiet concentration, her wand movements precise and delicate. Arthur watched with admiration. Hermione's magical ability had always been extraordinary, but she'd grown even more skilled since the war. Her theoretical knowledge combined with hard-won practical experience, making her formidable. After several minutes, the seal pulsed once, twice, then dissolved with a soft sigh. The door opened with a screech of protesting metal that made them all wince. Beyond lay darkness, thick and complete, untouched by the grey morning light. Harry conjured a ball of soft blue light that floated ahead of them, revealing a corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits, everything coated in dust, and the peculiar stillness of a place long undisturbed. "Lumos," Arthur whispered, adding his own wand light to Harry's. The combined illumination pushed back the shadows, revealing a space that was distinctly hybrid. Muggle, industrial design, mixed seamlessly with magical architecture. The pipes weren't just for show. Arthur could see that they carried both coolant and what appeared to be liquid magical energy, the faint shimmer inside the transparent sections giving away their dual purpose. They moved deeper into the facility, following signs that pointed toward central control. The building was vast, a maze of corridors and chambers, each one filled with equipment that fascinated Arthur despite the circumstances. Here was a transformer room where electrical step-down units stood alongside runic amplification arrays. There was a monitoring station where Muggle dial gauges shared space with magical measurement spheres, that still glowed faintly with residual energy. "It's like a museum of magical Muggle integration," Arthur said softly, pausing to examine a control panel that used both electrical switches and enchanted crystals. "The theory behind this is revolutionary. If this technology were shared openly, imagine what we could accomplish. Or what damage we could do," Ron reminded him gently. "Remember what we're here to prevent." The central control room, when they finally found it, took Arthur's breath away. It was circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that had been enchanted to show the night sky, currently displaying stars in patterns that Arthur recognized as being from some time in 1979, frozen at the moment when the facility had been officially sealed. The walls were lined with equipment, banks of Muggle computer monitors long since dark, magical scrying glasses that still pulsed with faint light, and in the center of it all, a massive circular console that combined both technological and magical control systems in a way Arthur had never imagined possible. "Merlin's beard," Hermione breathed, moving immediately to the console. "This is incredible. Look, they've created an interface that lets you control both the Muggle electrical systems and the magical energy flows from the same central point. The integration is seamless." Harry and Ron took up positions near the doors, watching for any sign of detection or response to their intrusion, while Arthur and Hermione approached the console. Up close, Arthur could see that it was still partially active. Some of the magical components glowed steadily, and several of the Muggle monitors showed faint green text scrolling in endless loops. System diagnostics, probably, running on automatic protocols that had been active for decades. Arthur found a dusty chair and pulled it up to the console, his fingers itching to touch the controls. "May I?" he asked Hermione, who nodded, already absorbed in examining the magical components. He began carefully, just observing at first, tracing the logic of the system. The Muggle computers were ancient by current standards. The files had mentioned installation in the late 70s, which meant this was technology nearly 50 years old. But it had been built to last, to run reliably with minimal maintenance, and the magical preservation charms had kept it in surprisingly good condition. After several minutes of cautious exploration, Arthur found what he was looking for, a status display that showed the current state of the convergence network. His heart sank as he read the information scrolling across the screen. "Hermione," he said quietly, "you need to see this." She leaned over his shoulder, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. The display showed all 47 convergence nodes in a graphical layout, each one represented by a small icon. 43 of them were glowing green, active and stable. 3 were yellow, active but experiencing anomalies. And 1, located in the heart of the city of London, was pulsing red. "What does red mean?" Ron asked, moving closer. Arthur scrolled through the system messages, his stomach tightening with each line he read. "It means that node is entering cascade failure. The magical containment is degrading faster than the system can compensate. And according to these projections..." He pulled up another screen, not wanting to believe what he was seeing. "It will reach critical threshold in approximately 72 hours. 3 days, Harry said flatly. "What happens when it reaches critical?" Hermione was already pulling up additional information on the magical scrying glasses. According to the Phase 2 protocols we photographed, critical threshold in any single node triggers an automatic failsafe. The system interprets it as catastrophic damage, exactly the kind of scenario Phase 2 was designed for. It initiates the full discharge sequence. The anti-magic detonation, Arthur confirmed, his voice heavy. 50 miles of collapsed enchantments, 12 hours of magical vulnerability, in 3 days, unless we can stop it. The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the equipment and the distant sound of wind against the cooling towers. Arthur sat back, his mind racing through possibilities. They had come here hoping to understand the system well enough to shut it down. Now they knew they had a deadline, and that the weapon wasn't just theoretically dangerous, but actively moving toward activation. "Can we shut down the failing node?" Ron asked. "Just turn it off somehow." "Not remotely," Hermione said, studying the displays. "Each node is independently powered, drawing energy from the local electrical grid. We'd have to physically access it. And even then..." She trailed off, running calculations in her head. The degradation has progressed too far. Attempting to shut it down manually would probably trigger the cascade immediately. "What about shutting down this facility?" Harry suggested. "If this is the central control, maybe we can override the failsafe from here." Arthur was already exploring that option, navigating through menus with growing frustration. The failsafe is hardwired into the system at a level below the central control. It was designed specifically to activate even if this facility was destroyed or compromised. The whole point was to ensure Phase 2 could initiate, no matter what happened. He found a technical manual stored in the computer's memory and began reading through it, his eyes scanning rapidly over dense technical prose. The more he read, the more his hope faded. The system was brilliantly designed, but fundamentally inflexible. Once certain conditions were met, Phase 2 would activate, and nothing short of physically destroying every single convergence node simultaneously could prevent it. "There has to be a way," Hermione said, that stubborn determination in her voice that Arthur had learned to recognize. She began examining the magical components more closely, running diagnostic spells, comparing what she was seeing to the theoretical frameworks in the files they'd studied. Every magical system has a weakness, a point where the logic can be interrupted or redirected. Arthur continued his own investigation, diving deeper into the computer systems. He found maintenance logs spanning decades, showing the slow degradation of the network. The entries were automated, clinical, noting each small failure and the system's compensating adjustments. He traced the progression, seeing how the Battle of Hogwarts had indeed triggered something, a massive surge of magical energy that the convergence nodes had detected and responded to, initiating a startup sequence that had been dormant for years. "Look at this," he said, pulling up a graphical timeline. The nodes started activating in sequence about 6 months ago, exactly when the Muggle engineers first noticed the anomalies. They're following a programmed startup protocol, one node coming online every few weeks. The failing node in the City of London was the first one activated, which means it's been under stress the longest. "And the stress is cumulative," Hermione added, following his logic. "Each activation cycle adds to the degradation until the containment fails completely." Ron was pacing now, his tactical mind working the problem from a different angle. Okay, so we can't shut down the failing node without triggering Phase 2 immediately. We can't override the failsafe from here. What about the other option? What if we found a way to make the system think the node isn't failing? Fake the data somehow. It was a clever thought, and Arthur explored it for several minutes, tracing through the monitoring systems. The problem is verification, he said finally. The central system doesn't just read data from the nodes. It actively queries them, sends test signals, and measures the response. We could potentially spoof the status reports, but we couldn't fake the actual physical response to the test signals. They worked through the morning, all four of them attacking the problem from different angles. Hermione delved deep into the magical theory, trying to find a spell or enchantment that might stabilize the failing node. Ron explored the physical security of the facility, checking whether there might be manual override systems they hadn't discovered. Harry divided his time between keeping watch and offering the perspective of someone who'd faced seemingly impossible magical problems before. Arthur lost himself in the Muggle technology, understanding it in a way that came naturally after years of passionate study. He traced circuits, read through code, mapped the logic of a system that had been designed by people who understood both magic and science. And slowly, gradually, an idea began to form. What if, he said slowly, interrupting a discussion between Hermione and Harry about magical resonance frequencies, we don't try to stop Phase 2 at all? They all turned to look at him. What do you mean? Hermione asked carefully. Arthur stood, moving to a large schematic on the wall that showed the entire convergence network in detail. Phase 2 is designed to create a massive, magical discharge, channeling all the energy from the electrical grid, amplifying it through the runic arrays, and releasing it all at once to collapse enchantments. But the actual mechanism. He traced his finger along the diagram, following the energy flow paths. It's not fundamentally destructive. It's transformative. It converts one type of energy into another and releases it in a specific way. You're thinking we could redirect it, Hermione said, her eyes lighting up with understanding. Change the output parameters so instead of an anti-magic detonation, it does something else. Exactly. The system has to discharge. The energy has to go somewhere. That's basic physics and basic magic. But we might be able to control where and how. Arthur pulled up the Phase 2 protocols on the console, studying them with new eyes. Look here. The targeting parameters. They're set to create a broad, diffuse field effect, but these controls suggest they could be adjusted for precision targeting instead. Harry leaned in, his expression intent. Could we target just the failing node? Use the discharge to repair it instead of creating a city-wide catastrophe? In theory. Arthur was already running calculations, his fingers flying over the keyboard, while simultaneously adjusting magical control crystals. If we recalibrated the runic amplification arrays, redirected the energy flow to focus on a single point, rather than dispersing across 50 miles, and modified the discharge frequency to match stabilization harmonics instead of disruption frequencies. It's possible, theoretically possible. But, Ron prompted, because there was always a but. But I'd need help from someone who understands both the Muggle electrical engineering and the magical theory at an expert level. This isn't something I can calculate alone. One mistake in either the technical parameters or the magical frequencies, and we could make things catastrophically worse. Hermione was already pulling out parchment, making notes. "We need Bill," she said decisively. "He's a curse breaker, specializes in complex magical systems. And Charlie might be useful too. Dragon handling involves a lot of work with magical energy transformation. Between all of us, we might just manage it," Arthur finished. He looked around at the 3 young people who had become so central to his life, who had fought a war and won it, and were now fighting still, in quieter but no less important ways. "But we'd need to work fast. 3 days isn't much time." "Then we'd better get started," Harry said simply. "Ron, can you contact your brothers? Hermione, what else do we need in terms of reference materials or equipment?" They began planning immediately, their voices overlapping in the way of people who had worked together through impossible situations before. Arthur turned back to the console, his mind already sketching out the modifications they would need to make, the calculations they would need to verify, the risks they would have to accept. Outside, the grey morning had given way to a grey afternoon, clouds pressing low over the marshland. Inside the facility, surrounded by the humming machinery of a forgotten weapon, Arthur Weasley felt the familiar thrill of a problem worth solving. Not just a puzzle to satisfy curiosity, but a challenge that mattered, that could save lives, protect both the magical and Muggle worlds from catastrophe. This was what his fascination with Muggles had always been about, he realized. Not just the wonder of how they accomplished so much without magic, but the recognition that their ingenuity and magical creativity were fundamentally the same thing, different expressions of the same human drive to understand, to build, to solve problems and make the world a little bit safer. 3 days, he murmured to himself, looking at the countdown on the screen. Well, we've faced worse odds. And as Hermione began sketching out theoretical frameworks, and Ron coordinated with his brothers, and Harry kept watch over them all, Arthur settled in to do what he did best. Understand how things worked, find the hidden connections, and use his unique combination of magical knowledge and Muggle expertise to save the day in the quiet, methodical way that had always been his particular gift. Sometimes the greatest magic is not found in spells or wands, but in the courage to stand for what is right, even when the cost might be everything you hold dear. Arthur understood this truth fully as he stood in the Burrow's kitchen Thursday morning, surrounded by his family, preparing to explain why he needed to ask so much of them once again. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating faces he loved more than life itself. Molly's worried expression, Bill's calm professionalism, Charlie's eager curiosity, and the determined trio of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who had already committed themselves to this cause. Molly had known something serious was happening the moment Arthur had asked to gather the family on a weekday morning. She prepared breakfast with her usual efficiency, but her hands had trembled slightly as she set out the dishes, and Arthur had seen her touching the clock on the wall, the one that showed where each family member was, as though drawing comfort from its familiar magic. "Right then," Arthur said, once everyone was settled around the table with tea and toast, though no one seemed particularly hungry. "I need to tell you all something important, and I need to ask for your help. But first, I want you to know that I understand this is a lot to ask. You've all earned your peace. If anyone wants to walk away after hearing what I have to say, I'll understand completely." "Dad," Bill said gently, "just tell us. We're family. We'll figure it out together." So Arthur told them everything. He started with the discovery of the archive, moved through the convergence nodes and their steady activation, explained the threat of Phase 2 and its catastrophic potential, and finished with the plan he and Hermione had begun developing to redirect the discharge. He spoke calmly, methodically, laying out facts and risks with the same careful precision he brought to all his work. The silence that followed was profound. Molly had her hand over her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. Charlie was leaning forward, his expression intense with the kind of focus he usually reserved for dangerous dragons. Bill sat very still, his scarred face thoughtful as he processed the information. 3 days, Bill said finally. You have 3 days to recalibrate an entire magical technological network that was designed by experts and has been dormant for decades. And if you get it wrong... If we get it wrong, we could trigger Phase 2 immediately, Arthur confirmed. Or we could create an uncontrolled discharge that would be even worse than the designed effect. Or we could simply fail to prevent the cascade failure, in which case Phase 2 activates anyway on its original timeline. And if you do nothing. Molly's voice was barely a whisper. Then in 3 days, every magical protection in London fails for 12 hours. The chaos would be... Arthur struggled to find words. Catastrophic doesn't begin to cover it. Magical creatures would escape their containments. Potions would spoil or explode. The hospital wards at St. Mungo's would collapse. Prisoners in Azkaban would be vulnerable. And that's not even considering the exposure risk. Muggles would witness things they shouldn't. The statute of secrecy would be shredded. Hermione pulled out the calculations she'd been working on. We've estimated potential casualties in the thousands. Most would be from secondary effects. Accidents, exposures, failures of crucial magical infrastructure. But some would be direct. People who depend on magical medical treatment, for instance, or those protected by witness protection enchantments. So we have to try, Charlie said simply. What do you need from us? The planning took most of the morning. Bill's expertise in curse-breaking proved invaluable. He understood complex magical systems in ways that even Hermione's theoretical knowledge couldn't match. He looked at the schematics they'd brought from the facility and immediately began identifying weak points, redundancies, and potential failure modes that Arthur and Hermione had missed. This is sophisticated work, Bill said, spreading out the diagrams across the kitchen table. Whoever designed this understood magical harmonics at a level you usually only see in ancient Egyptian tomb work. The way they've layered the runic arrays to create cascading amplification. It's actually quite beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. Charlie's contribution was different, but equally crucial. His years working with dragons had given him an intuitive understanding of magical energy transformation, how to channel raw magical force, how to control discharges, how to prevent catastrophic releases. It's not that different from helping a dragon regulate their fire, he explained. You can't stop the energy from releasing, but you can direct it, shape it, make it do what you want, instead of what it wants. Together, they refined Arthur's basic concept into something that might actually work. Instead of trying to prevent Phase 2's discharge, they would embrace it, but redirect the energy flow through modified pathways. Change the frequency to match healing harmonics instead of disruption patterns, and focus everything on the single failing node rather than dispersing it across London. It's like magical surgery, Hermione said, her quill flying across parchment as she made notes. We're using the system's own power to repair itself, turning a weapon into a healing tool. The calculations have to be perfect, Bill warned. We're talking about channeling energy measured in terawatts through magical conduits that were never designed for this kind of precision work. 1 decimal point off, and we could blow out the entire network. Ron had been quiet for most of the discussion, but now he spoke up. What about the Ministry? Marcus Yaxley and his people. They're not going to just let you waltz in and reprogram a classified weapon system, even if you have good intentions. It was the question Arthur had been dreading. I know. We need to work around them, at least initially. Once we've successfully modified the system, once we can demonstrate that we've prevented a catastrophe, then we can bring in the authorities properly. But if we go to them now, they'll shut us down, Harry finished grimly. I've seen how the Ministry works when it wants to suppress something. They'll invoke security protocols, seal the facility, and by the time they've finished forming committees to study the problem, it'll be too late. Molly had been listening to all of this with increasing distress, her hands wrapped around a teacup that had long since gone cold. Arthur, she said softly, and everyone fell silent. What you're describing, it sounds dangerous. Very dangerous. You could be hurt. Any of you could be hurt. I know, love. Arthur reached across the table to take her hand. But if we don't try... I know, she interrupted, and her voice was stronger now, though tears still glistened in her eyes. I know we have to try. I just... She looked around the table at her sons, at Harry and Hermione, who were as good as family, at Arthur with his gentle eyes and determined expression. We've lost so much already. I can't lose anyone else. The weight of Fred's absence hung in the air, as it always did at family gatherings, a space at the table that would never be filled. Arthur felt his throat tighten, but he kept his voice steady. We'll be careful. We'll have contingency plans and safety protocols, and we won't take unnecessary risks. Bill stood and moved to put his arms around his mother. Mum, you know we wouldn't be doing this if there was any other way. But this is what we do. We protect people. Dad found this threat, and now we're going to neutralize it. Together. Molly clung to her eldest son for a moment, then straightened, wiping her eyes with characteristic briskness. Right then, if you're all determined to risk your neck saving London, at least let me make sure you're properly fed first. You can't modify dangerous magical weapons on an empty stomach. The mood lightened slightly as Molly bustled about, preparing a proper lunch, refusing all offers of help with a firmness that brooked no argument. The others continued their planning, voices overlapping as they worked through technical details and contingencies. Arthur watched them all, his heart full of pride and fear in equal measure. After lunch, they divided responsibilities. Bill and Hermione would handle the magical theory, working out the exact runic modifications needed to redirect the discharge. Charlie would focus on energy regulation protocols, determining how to control the massive power flow during the transformation. Arthur would manage the Muggle technology side, programming the computers and adjusting the electrical systems. Harry and Ron would handle security, both protecting the facility during their work and watching for any ministry interference. "We should start tonight," Bill said, checking his watch. "Every hour we wait is an hour closer to cascade failure. If we work in shifts around the clock, we might just finish in time." They gathered supplies through the afternoon, magical equipment from Bill's curse-breaking kit, reference books from Hermione's extensive library, specialized tools from Arthur's workshop. As evening approached, they prepared to return to the facility, but Arthur noticed Harry and Ron having a quiet conversation in the corner of the garden. He approached them, just as Ron was saying, "Has to know. We can't keep her out of this." "I agree," Harry said, then noticed Arthur. "We were talking about Ginny. She deserves to know what's happening, and honestly, we could use her help. She's good in a crisis." Arthur felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to keep his daughter safely away from this danger. But another part, the part that respected her strength and capabilities, knew they were right. "I'll talk to Molly," he said. "Ginny's an adult. She gets to make her own choices." The conversation with Molly was difficult, but shorter than Arthur expected. "She's going to find out anyway," Molly said tiredly. "And she'll be furious if we try to protect her by keeping her in the dark. Better she's with you, where we know she's as safe as possible, than off investigating on her own." Ginny arrived within an hour of being contacted, her Quidditch practice apparently less important than a family emergency. She listened to the explanation with characteristic directness, asked several sharp questions that demonstrated exactly why she was a professional athlete, calm under pressure and focused on solutions, and promptly volunteered to help with security alongside Harry and Ron. As night fell, they gathered once more, this time for departure to the facility. Arthur looked around at the assembled group. His sons, his future daughter-in-law, Harry, who was like another son, Ginny fierce and determined, and Molly standing in the doorway of the burrow with her arms wrapped around herself. "Be careful," she said, and it was both a plea and a command. "All of you. And Arthur." She pulled him aside, speaking quietly. "I know you feel responsible for this. I know you think because you discovered it, you have to fix it. But please remember that you don't have to carry the whole world on your shoulders. Let them help. Don't try to be a hero." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Arthur said softly, touching her cheek. "I'm just trying to do what's right. The same thing you taught our children to do." They apparated in sequence, arriving at the facility under cover of darkness. The building loomed against the night sky, its cooling towers silhouetted against stars that seemed impossibly distant. Inside, they set up a working camp in the central control room, sleeping bags in one corner for those who needed rest, a makeshift kitchen area with a portable stove for tea and simple meals, and multiple workstations where different aspects of the problem could be tackled simultaneously. Bill took charge of the magical modifications, working with a precision that Arthur found mesmerizing. He adjusted runes with tiny etching tools, sometimes working for an hour on a single symbol, checking and rechecking his calculations before making each change. Curse breaking is 90% patience and 10% knowing when to be bold, he explained, when Arthur commented on his methodical approach. Rush this, and we all die. Simple as that. Hermione worked alongside him, cross-referencing theoretical frameworks and running diagnostic spells to verify each modification. The two of them developed a rhythm, Bill's practical expertise complementing Hermione's academic brilliance in a partnership that produced results faster than either could have managed alone. Charlie stationed himself at the main energy regulation console, monitoring the convergence network in real time. He'd created a visual display, something he called his Dragon Board, that showed the energy flow through each node as colored lights. Green is stable, yellow is stressed, red is critical, he explained. Right now, we've got 1 red, 3 yellows, and the rest are slowly shifting from green to yellow. We're running out of time. Arthur immersed himself in the Muggle technology, fingers flying over keyboards as he modified code that was older than some of his children. The programming language was archaic, but the logic was sound, and he found himself appreciating the cleverness of the original engineers. They'd built something designed to last, to run autonomously for decades, and it had done exactly that. Now he needed to convince it to do something slightly different. The work was painstaking. Each modification had to be tested, verified, and integrated with everyone else's changes. They couldn't simply make all the adjustments and hope for the best. Each step had to be validated before moving to the next. It was like defusing a bomb while simultaneously rebuilding it into something else entirely. Hours blurred together. People took turns sleeping, though no one managed more than a few hours at a time. Molly sent food via owl, sandwiches, thermoses of soup, chocolate for energy. The owls looked confused by the industrial setting, but they delivered their parcels faithfully. Friday became Saturday. The countdown on Arthur's screen showed 57 hours until cascade failure. They were making progress, but it was agonizingly slow. Every calculation had to be perfect. Every modification had to be exact. Saturday afternoon brought their first real crisis. Hermione was testing a modified runic sequence when something went wrong. The magical energy flow spiked suddenly. Lights flickered throughout the facility, and alarms that hadn't sounded in decades began wailing. Charlie reacted instantly, manually throttling back the energy flow, while Bill scrambled to reverse the modification. For 5 terrifying minutes, Arthur watched the status displays flash, warning after warning. The failing node in the city of London pulse in angry red as the stress on it increased dramatically. Then, just as suddenly, it stabilized. The alarms quieted. The lights steadied. Charlie wiped sweat from his forehead and announced shakily that they'd pulled back from the edge. "What happened?" Ron asked, his wand still drawn, ready to defend against threats that were purely magical and therefore beyond his ability to fight. "My fault," Hermione said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "I misread one of the harmonic frequency calculations. The resonance pattern I created was opposite to what we needed. It amplified the disruption instead of countering it." "Easy mistake," Bill said, though his hands were shaking slightly as he checked the systems. "The mathematics are incredibly complex. I should have caught it in review." "We're all tired," Arthur said firmly. "We need to rotate more frequently, make sure fresh eyes are checking every change. No one works more than 3 hours without a break." They implemented the new protocols, and the work continued. Saturday night brought its own challenges. A ministry owl arrived with an official summons for Arthur, requiring his presence Monday morning for urgent consultations regarding unauthorized activities. The phrasing was ominous, suggesting that Marcus Yaxley and his allies were preparing to move against them. "Monday morning," Harry read over Arthur's shoulder. "That gives us until then. They're probably waiting to see if we actually try to do anything, or if we'll back down." "We'll be done by then," Bill said with more confidence than Arthur felt. "One way or another, this will be resolved by Monday morning." Sunday morning, with less than 30 hours remaining, they reached the final phase of modifications. Everything was in place. The runic arrays had been adjusted, the energy regulation protocols reprogrammed, the targeting parameters refined to focus on the single failing node. All that remained was to activate the system and hope it worked. But there was a complication. To implement the changes, they needed to bring the entire convergence network fully online, including the failing node. For approximately 10 minutes, while the modifications were being applied, the system would be unstable. If anything went wrong during those 10 minutes, Phase 2 could trigger immediately. "It's a risk we have to take," Bill said quietly. "There's no way to apply the changes incrementally. It's all or nothing." Arthur looked around at the faces of his family, seeing determination mixed with fear. These people had already given so much. They had fought a war, lost people they loved, earned their peace. And here they were, once again put themselves at risk for others. "I need to say something," Arthur said, his voice rough with emotion. "Before we do this, I need you all to know how proud I am, not just of your skill or your courage, but of your hearts. You choose to stand up, to protect people, even when it would be easier and safer to walk away. That's true magic, the kind that matters most." "Dad," Ron said, his voice thick, "we learned it from you and Mum. You taught us to do what's right, even when it's hard." Molly's voice crackled through the magical communication mirror Arthur had set up for her. She'd been following their progress remotely, unable to stay away, despite being unable to help directly. "Arthur Weasley, you bring my children home safe. Do you hear me? All of them, including Harry and Hermione." "I promise," Arthur said, hoping it was a promise he could keep. They made final checks, everyone reviewing their specific responsibilities one last time. Harry and Ron positioned themselves at the facility's perimeter, ready to defend against any interference. Ginny monitored the communication channels, ready to alert them if the Ministry showed up. Charlie had his hands on the energy regulation controls, prepared to shut everything down manually if necessary. Bill stood ready to make real-time adjustments to the runic arrays if the energy flows deviated from projections. Hermione would monitor the magical harmonics, watching for the dangerous resonance patterns that had nearly caused disaster before. And Arthur sat at the central console, hands hovering over the keyboard, ready to initiate the sequence that would either save London or destroy it. "Everyone ready?" he asked, his voice surprisingly steady. A chorus of affirmatives answered him. Arthur took a deep breath, thought of Molly and his family and all the people in London who had no idea their safety depended on what happened in the next 10 minutes, and began typing the activation sequence. In the end, Arthur Weasley's greatest discovery was not in archives or magical devices, but in bridging two worlds, showing that the boundaries between magic and science, between wizards and muggles, were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. The activation sequence had taken exactly 9 minutes and 43 seconds, each second stretching into eternity as Arthur watched the displays, his finger hovering over the emergency shutdown that Bill had insisted they have ready, even though they all knew it probably wouldn't work if things went wrong. The convergence network had come alive in stages, each node lighting up on Charlie's dragonboard in rapid succession. The energy flow had spiked exactly as predicted, the magical harmonics rising to levels that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Hermione had called out readings in a steady stream, her voice never wavering, even when the numbers climbed into ranges that should have been impossible. Bill had adjusted runic arrays on the fly, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had diffused ancient curses in tombs that predated Hogwarts. And then, at exactly 9 minutes and 37 seconds, the failing node in the City of London had flared brilliant gold on the displays. The modified discharge had hit it with precision that made Arthur's heart sing with professional pride. All that energy, channeled through London's electrical grid, focused through carefully calibrated magical arrays, and delivered with surgical accuracy to heal rather than destroy. For 6 seconds, the longest 6 seconds of Arthur's life, the systems had trembled on the knife's edge between success and catastrophic failure. Then the node had stabilized, its angry red glow fading to steady amber, then to peaceful green. The energy flow had normalized, the harmonics had settled into perfect resonance, and the entire convergence network had achieved a stable state for the first time in months. They had stood in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe it had worked. Then Charlie had let out a whoop of triumph, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, laughing with relief and exhaustion, embracing each other with the fierce joy of people who had faced death and survived. That had been Sunday evening. Now, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, 3 days later, Arthur sat in Kingsley Shacklebolt's office at the Ministry, surrounded by people who would determine what happened next. The intervening days had been chaotic. Once they'd successfully stabilized the network, Arthur had insisted on full documentation before they left the facility. They'd photographed everything, recorded every step of their modifications, created a complete record of both the original threat and their solution. Then, and only then, had Arthur contacted Kingsley directly through secure channels, bypassing Marcus Yaxley and his allies entirely. Kingsley's response had been swift and decisive. He'd placed the facility under Auror protection, sealed the archive against further tampering, and launched a formal investigation into the conspiracy to suppress information about Project Convergence. Marcus Yaxley was currently suspended pending inquiry, along with 3 other senior officials. The morning edition of the Daily Prophet had carried a carefully worded statement about newly discovered historical defense systems requiring evaluation, which was ministry speak for "we found something alarming, and we're trying not to cause panic." Now Arthur sat across from the Minister for Magic, with Bill, Hermione, and Harry beside him. Ron and Charlie had wanted to come too, but someone needed to actually monitor the convergence network. It was stable now, but it still required oversight. Ginny had volunteered to help, claiming her Quidditch team owed her some time off after she'd missed 3 days of practice. "Let me make sure I understand," Kingsley said, his deep voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. For nearly 40 years, the Ministry operated a classified weapon system embedded in Muggle infrastructure. This system was funded through a combination of legitimate defense appropriations and what appears to be systematic embezzlement. When the war ended, rather than decommissioning the system properly, certain officials chose to seal the records and hope it would be forgotten. And when Arthur discovered it and began investigating, those same officials, or their descendants and allies, attempted to suppress his inquiry through threats and intimidation. That's an accurate summary, yes, Arthur said quietly. Kingsley leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. And you, Arthur, rather than bringing this to official attention immediately, recruited your family and friends to break into a classified facility and modify a weapon system without authorization. Arthur felt his stomach tighten. When put that way, it sounded rather damning. Minister, Which, Kingsley continued, a hint of warmth entering his voice, prevented what would have been the single greatest magical catastrophe in modern British history. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes has completed their assessment. If Phase 2 had activated as originally designed, the casualty estimates are sobering. You saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. The relief Arthur felt was physical, like a weight lifting from his chest. Beside him, he heard Hermione exhale softly. However, Kingsley said, and the steel returned to his voice, we cannot simply ignore the procedural violations. You accessed classified materials without authorization. You modified ministry property without oversight. You recruited civilians into what was effectively a ministry operation. With respect, Minister, Bill spoke up, it wasn't a ministry operation. It was a cover-up that the ministry was actively participating in. If Dad had gone through official channels, he would have been shut down before he could prevent the disaster. I know, Kingsley said softly, which is why I'm not bringing charges. But I am implementing new protocols. The convergence network will be properly decommissioned under expert supervision. Your supervision, Arthur, if you're willing. Every aspect of Project Convergence will be documented for the historical record. And we're establishing a new department to prevent this kind of institutional memory loss from happening again. Arthur blinked. A new department? The Department of Muggle Magical Relations, Kingsley said, a slight smile crossing his face. We need formal structures for understanding the intersection of our world with the non-magical one. We need experts who can recognize when Muggle technology and magical practice are influencing each other. We need people who won't dismiss Muggle achievements as quaint curiosities, but will see them as the remarkable accomplishments they are. He paused meaningfully. We need you, Arthur. The offer hung in the air. Arthur felt Hermione's hand squeeze his arm encouragingly. Minister, I'm honoured, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to... You just saved London using a combination of Muggle electrical engineering and magical theory that nobody else in this building could have managed, Kingsley interrupted. You recognized a threat that our so-called experts missed or deliberately ignored. You understood systems that bridge two worlds because you're one of the few wizards who genuinely respects both. If that doesn't qualify you, I don't know what would. Arthur thought about it, about the years he'd spent in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, confiscating enchanted teapots and explaining why you couldn't put expansion charms on automobiles. Good work, important work, but limited in scope. What Kingsley was offering was a chance to build something new, to create bridges instead of merely enforcing boundaries. "I'd want Hermione involved," Arthur said slowly, "as a consultant at least. Her theoretical understanding of magical Muggle integration is extraordinary." "Already assumed," Kingsley said, nodding to Hermione. "Though I suspect Miss Granger has her own career ambitions that might conflict with a full-time position." "I'm starting law school in the autumn," Hermione confirmed, "but I'd be happy to consult on cases that involve complex magical theory." This was, she paused, searching for words. "This was the most intellectually challenging thing I've done since the war. I'd forgotten how satisfying it is to solve problems that matter." They spent the next hour discussing details: the decommissioning timeline for the Convergence Network, the scope of the new department, the personnel Arthur would need. Kingsley was thorough, but pragmatic, clearly eager to turn a near disaster into an opportunity for positive change. As the meeting wound down, Harry spoke for the first time. "What about the people who tried to cover this up? Yaxley and the others?" Kingsley's expression hardened. "They'll face appropriate consequences. Some will be prosecuted for obstruction and abuse of office. Others will simply find their careers at the ministry have come to an end. And the families who profited from the original embezzlement will be given an opportunity to repay what was stolen, with interest, or face public disclosure and legal action." "Good," Harry said simply. They left Kingsley's office together, walking through the ministry corridors that Arthur had navigated for so many years. But everything felt different now, lighter somehow. The weight of secrets had been lifted, replaced by the satisfaction of problems solved and new possibilities opening up. "Dad," Hermione said as they reached the atrium, "I'm really proud of you. You could have let this go. You could have accepted Marcus's warnings and gone back to safe, quiet work. But you didn't." "Well," Arthur said, adjusting his glasses in a gesture that was half embarrassment, half pleasure, "someone had to do something. And I suppose I was in the right place at the right time with the right combination of knowledge." "No," Bill corrected gently. "You were the right person. There's a difference." The weeks that followed were busy, but satisfying. Arthur oversaw the decommissioning of the Convergence Network with the same methodical care he brought to all his work. Each node was carefully shut down, its magical components extracted and studied before being safely stored in the Department of Mysteries for future research. The facility itself was transformed from a forgotten weapon into a research center, a place where wizards and, eventually, cautiously, Muggle experts could study the intersection of magic and technology in a controlled environment. The archive was preserved and made accessible to authorized researchers, its contents forming the foundation of new academic studies into the history of magical Muggle relations. Several young witches and wizards expressed interest in specializing in this newly recognized field, and Arthur found himself giving lectures at Hogwarts about the importance of understanding both worlds. At home, life returned to a comfortable rhythm. Molly stopped checking the family clock quite so obsessively, reassured that Arthur's new work, while important, was considerably less dangerous than preventing magical catastrophes. The burrow filled with the usual chaos of family gatherings, though now the conversations often turned to Arthur's work in ways they never had before. "Did you really tell the minister that Muggle electrical theory is just as sophisticated as magical enchantment. Ron asked one Sunday over lunch, equal parts impressed and amused. I said they were different, but equally valid approaches to manipulating fundamental forces, Arthur clarified. And it's true. Muggles have accomplished extraordinary things without magic. We'd be foolish not to learn from them. Hear, hear, Hermione said, raising her glass in a toast, to bridges between worlds. And to Dad, Ginny added, who was building those bridges long before anyone else thought they were important. Arthur felt his face flush with pleasure. He looked around the table at his family, Molly beaming with pride, his children and their partners laughing and talking, Harry and Hermione so thoroughly integrated into the Weasley clan that he barely remembered a time when they hadn't been there. This was what mattered. Not recognition or acclaim, but the knowledge that he'd used his particular gifts to make the world a little bit safer for everyone in it. Later, as the autumn sun began to set and the family gathering dispersed, Arthur retreated to his workshop. The shed was exactly as cluttered as ever, filled with Muggle artifacts in various states of disassembly. But now he looked at them with new eyes, not just curiosities to be studied, but evidence of human ingenuity that deserved respect. He picked up an old telephone receiver, turning it over in his hands, thinking about the convergence network and how wires could carry voices or power or even, in the right circumstances, magic itself. The interconnectedness of it all fascinated him, the way everything from the smallest circuit to the largest magical array followed similar principles of energy and transformation. Still tinkering, love? Molly's voice came from the doorway. Arthur looked up, smiling. Always, though I think I finally understand what I've been looking for all these years. Oh? Molly stepped inside, navigating the familiar chaos with practiced ease. I thought I was just curious about how things worked, Arthur said slowly. But really, I was looking for connections, for proof that the magical and non-magical worlds aren't as separate as we pretend they are. That at a fundamental level, we're all just people trying to understand the world around us and make it better. Molly kissed his cheek gently. You've always seen connections others missed. It's one of the things I love about you. As night fell over the burrow and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Arthur felt a deep sense of contentment. His fascination with Muggles had been mocked for years, dismissed as an eccentric hobby unsuited to a serious wizard. But that fascination had led him to discover a hidden threat, to prevent a catastrophe, to bridge worlds in ways that would influence the wizarding world for generations. He thought about young witches and wizards who would grow up in a world where understanding Muggles was considered valuable rather than odd. He thought about the research that would emerge from studying the convergence network, the new spells and technologies that might be developed by properly combining magical and scientific principles. He thought about a future where the walls between worlds might be a little bit lower, a little bit easier to cross. And he thought about Fred, who had loved to tinker and invent, who had seen the potential in combining magic with unexpected elements, who would have been absolutely delighted by the convergence network's beautiful, terrible complexity. This work, Arthur realized, was a tribute to his lost son, a commitment to curiosity, to innovation, to the idea that the best solutions often come from looking where others haven't thought to look. In the wizarding world, stories would be told of Arthur Weasley in the years to come. Not grand tales of dramatic battles or powerful magic, but quieter stories of a gentle man whose curiosity and courage had saved countless lives. Stories of someone who saw value where others saw oddity, who built bridges where others built walls, who proved that heroism comes in many forms. The portraits at Hogwarts would eventually include his likeness, not in the headmaster's office, but in the library, where students researching Muggle studies would find his painted image ready with encouragement and advice. Never dismiss what you don't understand, the portrait would tell eager young minds. The most extraordinary discoveries often hide in the most ordinary places. But that was the future. Tonight, Arthur Weasley was simply a man in his workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, thinking about connections and possibilities and the endless wonder of a world that still held so many secrets waiting to be discovered. Dear listener, let Arthur's story carry you gently into sleep. Picture the burrow peaceful in starlight, the workshop lamp glowing warm in the darkness, and a gentleman who changed the world by caring about things others ignored. Rest now, knowing that curiosity is its own kind of magic, that kindness is its own kind of strength, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs. Sleep peacefully, wrapped in the quiet certainty that bridges once built connect worlds forever.